This is your reality check.
Welcome to The Reality Check, the weekly Canadian show that explores a wide range of controversies and curiosities using science and critical thinking. Today is July 15th, 2021, and I'm producer Pat. We have three interesting segments for you this week. Darren takes us through a book called Drug Use for Grown-Ups by Hart, and Adam does a deep dive into whether Subway's tuna sandwiches are actually made from tuna. But first, Cristina guides us through what the top 40 is and how it works.
Before I dive into the top 40, a little confession. Me and the RC crew have a perennial group chat going where we interact pretty much every day. When I mentioned covering this topic, the Ottawa-based lads were stoked because, in Darren's words, I've long supported a requested all the musical knowledge be leveraged. For those new to the show, you may not know I have a long career in the music industry. Pat was a touring and recording musician, is also quite familiar with its inner workings. Adam reminded us that a lot of things we may consider common knowledge, probably not common knowledge to the average person. I admitted to them that whenever I think about covering a music-related segment, even though it's my field of expertise, I really overthink it. Not to mention there are lots of resources at our fingertips now, so the average person has a lot more access behind the curtain. But there are a few cool things I'd like to cover in future. One topic is a long-standing promise to Dr. Astro Stu about why certain songs get on the radio, and I plan to wrangle a couple of cool guests who are experts in the field to help out with that one. I also think it'll be more fun when we all get to tape the show together, as I'm sure Darren and Adam will have some fun questions. So for now, I'm going to talk about the top 40, its genesis, what it is, because I'll bet many people who've heard the term don't actually really know what it means. Now, Wikipedia gives a good overall definition. In the music industry, the top 40 is the current 40 most popular songs in a particular genre. It is the best-selling or most frequently broadcast popular music. Record charts have traditionally consisted of a total of 40 songs. Top 40 or contemporary hit radio is also a radio format. In future, I'll talk about different radio formats and how songs get worked to radio, but for now, let's rewind to the 1950s. Now, you can't talk about the top 40 and not mention the name Todd Storrs, the man credited with inventing the top 40 radio format. Enter Storrs, who bought KOWH in Omaha with his dad in the early 50s. Now, Storrs was an astute dude. He noticed how people reacted to certain songs that played continuously on jukeboxes. If you don't know what a jukebox is, you may have seen one in an old school diner or the show Happy Days, and if not, just Google it. So he came up with the idea to create a quote-unquote top 40 format, where the most popular songs of the day got played on rotation, so repetitively. Now this to me sounds a bit torturous, but I get it. Instead of letting DJs play whatever they like, give the people what they want. More specifically, the younger audience who were huge consumers and music influencers of their day. I don't think that has changed much. Storrs also had a pretty brilliant idea that he is credited with pioneering, surveying record stores to learn which singles were hot with consumers, which is a model that lived on for years. In short, he bought a few stations and flipped them to top 40 radio, and the format was born. Now, in the late 50s, rock and roll became the dominant form of popular music, and along with it, top 40 radio flourished, with top 40 countdowns ruling the airwaves. In the 70s, top 40 radio started to lose its original luster, so to speak, when FM radio became popular. Now, many FM stations offered listeners a reprieve from the format and more diverse programming. By the 2000s, the term top 40 grew beyond describing radio formats, and it's used more generally in reference to mainstream pop. Now, in 1992, Billboard debuted a mainstream top 40 radio chart. I thought it would have happened a bit earlier, but it was 1992. Billboard is an entity in the music industry which tabulates the relative weekly popularity of songs and albums. I'm sure many of you have heard of the Billboard charts. This specific chart is compiled by surveying which songs are played on specific top 40 radio stations. We call those reporting stations. So it's stations that actually, their airplay is used to tabulate the charts. Not all radio stations are included. I'll get into that on a future TRC episode because it is pretty fascinating if you don't know much about it. But one way to put it, to give you a bit of context for now, is that bigger cities aka markets, have bigger audiences. So if those stations play a song, it has more weight than if a smaller town with a radio station plays that song. The more reporting stations that add your song to rotation and how often they play it, so light, medium, heavy rotation, that determines your trajectory, up or down, on that chart. Now, these charts are kept fresh or current by moving songs that rank below 15 and have spent more than 20 weeks on the top 40 to something called recurrent. Now, the rule with Mediabase, an airplay reporting service here in Canada, is songs trending down in spins below number 10 are removed after 20 weeks. Did you know that the lifespan of a typical radio single is 8 to 12 weeks? Going to recurrent is really just part of a hit song's circle of life, if you will. Now, I can't talk about Top 40 without talking about Casey Kasem. Some of you young folk may not remember, but Kasem famously hosted the syndicated radio show American Top 40, which debuted in 1970, and Top 40 really became ubiquitous after that. It featured the top 40 of Billboard's Hot 100 singles chart, and with syndication on over 500 radio stations worldwide, including here in Canada, I used to listen to it all the time. To say it had an impact is an understatement. Listeners were encouraged to call their local radio stations to hear songs featured in the top 40, which in turn helped fuel record sales and artist popularities and chart numbers. So yeah, it was a big deal. Now, Kasem since passed away. He left the show in 88 and its popularity waned, and the show actually ended officially in 1995. Now, there are many iterations of music charts today. Streaming services like Spotify and Apple Music, etc., have definitely changed the landscape, and younger audiences consume music much differently than I used to. You can stream it from your pocket. I couldn't do that. And even though it was coined decades ago, the term Top 40 remains synonymous with music the teen in your household is likely cranking from their room right now. Now, if you have any interesting music biz related topics that you'd like us to cover, please hit us up. I'd love to hear them. Write us at info@trcpodcast.com or leave a comment on this episode's post at trcpodcast.com, which Darren or Adam would say is a great website. Until next time, stay classy, not smartassy, and stay safe.
Is Subway tuna made out of tuna?
Do you mean tuna you find on the subway?
Yes. Probably you don't want to eat that. So is Subway bread? Is Subway chicken? Are the subs even submarines? And what does that have to do with the subway train? I will not answer any of those other questions.
Yellow submarines?
We all live in the yellow submarine. A New York Times article titled "The Big Tuna Sandwich Mystery," which most people only read the headline and one-line summary for, went viral recently. Now, normally I blame people for not reading articles and sharing or commenting on them anyway, but I think the New York Times paywall can shoulder some of the blame. I had read the article when it first came out, and I didn't find it terribly convincing. Full disclosure, I ate Subway once, twice, sometimes 3 times a week. I've had the tuna a few times years ago, but it isn't my preference. I usually get the oven-roasted chicken, which the CBC said was only about 50% chicken. That's another thing. So, this tuna thing. The idea here is that Subway tuna, the tuna in a Subway sandwich, is not actually tuna. Well, what would it be?
It's not a tuna?
Well, presumably it'd be some other kind of fish, but it's not clear what that would be. The article doesn't really get into that specifics. So the article is really kind of a story. The actual scientific claim is actually very simple. Lady took some Subway tuna sandwich samples, sent them to a lab. They couldn't tell whether or not there was tuna in it. That's it. But I get the point of dressing up the story. That's why I tell you about my love of oven-roasted chicken sandwiches at Subway before I do my segment on Subway tuna. So the New York Times reporter had the idea to do this test after a Washington Post article made similar allegations. So I'll round back to what the Washington Post said after I talked about this New York Times piece. So, did you want to know the history and some stats on canned tuna? Well, that's not really relevant. The article talked about that. So much to say, tuna is popular, and when canned, it has a very long shelf life. I was surprised to read that the tuna and turkey sandwiches are Subway's most popular sandwiches in the U.S. I would have thought it would be something else.
I wonder if that's for health reasons or perceived health reasons.
Maybe.
Turkey, a bit healthy. Tuna, it's fish. People think fish healthy, although if there's lots of mayo, the tuna is actually the worst thing for you.
Tuna is one of the higher calorie sandwiches at Subway because they put their calories, at least in Canada, they put on a little sticker, so you can see it right there on the menu. So New York Times reporter bought the equivalent of 5-foot-long tuna sandwiches, so 60 total inches of sandwich. And she said she had trouble finding a lab to test her samples. She said a handful declined her inquiry because of technical limitations, and finally one agreed, and it ran a PCR test. So what's that? A polymerase chain reaction is a biochemical technique to detect fragments of DNA by amplifying them via enzymatic replication. So ultimately, this is done to be able to detect a certain DNA sequence in a sample of meat. In this case, the lab looked at the tuna sub meat and tried to find tuna DNA from any of 5 different types of tuna fish that they compared it to, the fish that is a tuna.
Now, did those particular fish have to sign up on like Ancestry? Did they sign a waiver for their confidential DNA to be understood?
No, but their cousins did, and is basically as good as
the cousins always get you.
Yep. So there are some 15 types of species of tuna. Subway claims to use skipjack and yellowfin, and those were 2 that the lab looked at. So, it's possible that they took some tuna types that weren't some that other types of edible tuna come from. So the author bought 3 Subway sandwiches with basically only bread and tuna. So she didn't put veggies, she didn't put any sauces to contaminate the specimen. And then she had a sample which was lost in transit, but then another made it to the lab. So the lab determined, and I quote, "No amplifiable tuna DNA was present in the sample, and so we obtained no amplification products from the DNA. Therefore, we cannot identify the species." There's 2 conclusions. One, it's so heavily processed that whatever we could pull out, we couldn't make an identification, or we got some and there's just nothing there that's tuna. Now, this is an important distinction that, to be fair, the New York Times is being very straightforward about. It seems that most people commenting on these articles aren't appreciating the nuance. They just figured, oh, there's no tuna in the tuna. So it's pretty easy for tuna to break down. So I've known this since reading Jurassic Park back in the day. This is why they spliced frog DNA with the dinosaurs in the book. And it's also the reason which makes the basic idea of the movie implausible. You can't we'll never be able to create Jurassic Park because we'll never be able to find DNA of dinosaurs.
But also, you won't be able to do it with that attitude.
No. I need to have like a really reckless business guy, Hawaiian shirt kind of attitude. So this tuna might have been frozen. It had been cooked. It was mixed with mayonnaise. It sat in a store chilled for up to 72 hours. And then it was packed with ice packs, mailed across the country to a lab. And then we don't know exactly what the lab did with it. They did their test. Could this have damaged the DNA in the sandwich? Absolutely possible, right? I don't know enough about DNA or PCR testing to know how likely this is at any of these particular steps, but the lab itself does admit that this is a possibility that the DNA sample was damaged. Cooking a meat can denature the DNA, making it impossible to test. This may be why a quote, handful of labs weren't willing to test the tuna sub sample. So let's compare that against the alternate explanation. There's some conspiracy at Subway to pass off some other fish as tuna, which is itself a type of fish that isn't actually all that expensive and somewhat common. What other evidence is there that Subway tuna may or may not be tuna? So what prompted this research, as I mentioned, was a Washington Post article with similar results. So a lawsuit was filed in California claiming that the tuna sub wasn't tuna. Lab tests were done with multiple samples taken from Subway restaurants in California and tested in labs which concluded that there was, quote, a mixture of various concoctions that do not constitute tuna, yet have been blended together by defendants to imitate the appearance of tuna. So the plaintiff is suing Subway for fraud, intentional misrepresentation, unjust enrichment, and other claims. And Subway has consistently denied the claims that their tuna isn't tuna. But according to the New York Times piece, the plaintiffs in this claim have changed their tune and are now arguing simply that Subway's tuna isn't, and I quote, 100% sustainably caught skipjack and yellowfin tuna. So whether that claim is true or not is very different than the claim that their tuna isn't actually tuna.
Yeah, all those words narrow the scope a lot.
Oh, yeah.
If there wasn't an issue from Subway's side, now it seems like there's an issue on the plaintiff's side.
Yes.
Something fishy is going on.
Now, Inside Edition had sent 3 tuna subsamples obtained in New York to labs, and they were all found to be tuna. So could the tuna in California be different? Maybe. When I traveled to San Diego a few years back, I ate a ton of tuna because it's on the Pacific Ocean. There's a ton of tuna there. It would certainly be odd for the New York subway tuna to be real, but the California tuna to not be real, to be something completely different. But that's possible, right? You can have different franchises getting their meat from different sources. I don't know exactly how the subway meat distribution channels work across the United States. It also could be the wrong type of tuna. So New York tuna might be Atlantic. California could be from the Pacific. They might simply have tested 5 types of tuna, and they happen to be using one of the 10 different types of tuna, even though they said it was one of those 5 that they tested. I'm not a tuna expert, but rather than it being another fish entirely, it may just be a different type of tuna. So it's a different level of sort of false advertising. The article also discusses the in-store experience a bit. According to the sandwich artists, so that's what they call the people who work at Subway, make your Subway sandwiches, they get the tuna in these aluminum pouches, which look like a slab of tuna. Then they take it apart and mix it with mayonnaise. So they actually do sort of flake apart the fish. Once mixed, it has a 72-hour shelf life. That's the maximum time that a Subway meat can be left out. And the tuna is labeled tuna. So this aluminum package does say tuna on it. So the packaging, the employees receive say tuna, whether that's a conspiracy or that it's some other fish, it would need to sort of come from further up than the employees at Subway. A Subway employee that was mentioned in the article said that they were allergic to fish and that when they consumed the Subway tuna sub, I don't know why they did this, they were quite sick, which is an odd way to confirm that it's actually fish, but if we follow the logic, that's the idea.
It doesn't count against it. It's a weak supportive evidence.
Yes. So what else would it be, right? There's imitation crab that's actually made of fish, but what would you make fake fish out of? Fish is the cheap one, right? As we see with the prices of things like Beyond Meat, meat substitutes, at least convincing meat substitutes that have the taste and texture of that meat, are often much more expensive than the real thing. You have to think of what Subway's motivation is here. So the idea isn't necessarily that it isn't fish, just that it's some other kind of cheap fish. And does that matter? I guess maybe. So fish fraud is actually very common. Usually it's people passing off a cheaper fish, pretending that it is a more expensive one. But the types of tuna that are used at Subway, they're not all that rare and expensive. So sushi grade tuna is quite expensive, as is fresh tuna. Canned tuna, on the other hand, it's not all that expensive. So you get a big fish, you can it, it's preserved, and it'll last for years. I was on a trip to St. Lucia. I recall they caught a single large tuna and they used it to serve to everyone in the resort for this buffet dinner. And they served everyone out of this one massive fish. And I was like, oh wow, tuna's huge. This isn't like a trout that you catch a bunch just to serve one meal. So this was exotic to me, a traveling person, but it sort of highlights how much meat you can get out of that one fish. So understand what's being suggested here. So Subway, worried about their bottom line, would get some cheaper fish that looks and tastes like tuna, and then they would put it in a package that says tuna, and then they would lie to the consumers about it, even though it's one of their top-selling sandwich ingredients. And they've been doing it for decades, and no one's really been a whistleblower on this. And maybe they don't actually do it in all their stores because those New York ones were actually tuna. Or the DNA was damaged and the sample wasn't conclusive. The test wasn't conclusive. That's the alternative, right? To me, that seems like that's a possibility. And there was a similar fuss made about 4 years ago when CBC Marketplace did some tests showing that Subway's chicken, which is used in their oven roasted chicken option, contains only 56.3% chicken. So while there's a bit of spice to be expected, it should only be a few percentage points. But Subway denied that this was the case. CBC claimed that the rest was mostly soy, but Subway claims they only have about 1% soy in their chicken.
Imagine the rest was tuna. That's where it's going, Adam. Don't you see? The conspiracy goes all the way to the top.
It's we mixed up the bags.
Exactly.
Just that explains the weird taste of my chicken.
The chicken of the sea, some might say.
Actually, Jessica Simpson even weighed in on this on this controversy. So it was never conclusively determined what the issue with the chicken test was. Was it due to some limitation of lab testing, or is the Subway chicken really only about 50% chicken? I can't really answer that. But really, what we want to know is the Subway tuna. I don't know. I don't have an answer. There are possibilities, and it's difficult to give all of them accurate probabilities. It's worth considering that the Subway tuna not being made out of tuna isn't a necessary explanation here. The DNA in the tuna likely was deteriorated, and potentially deteriorated enough that the tests weren't conclusive. The other idea that Subway is using some other product, likely another fish, and passing it off as the relatively inexpensive tuna seems like an unnecessarily complex thing to do when just using real tuna is easiest. It's affordable. Subway can afford to do it. We do know that the tuna in New York City was actually real tuna, which suggests that the same could very plausibly be true for the rest of the country.
So, as you said, because of the New York data and some other things, and we can't get the DNA to actually detect whether it's tuna or not, it seems like there's at least a provisional belief, which is reasonable, that it is tuna. But it's also possibly the case, I don't know enough about fish, you may get a lower quality fish.
Yeah.
Maybe like a larger trawling thing. Like when I say dolphin-free tuna, you're like, well, maybe there's some dolphins in there. And they don't want to talk about that.
Yeah.
And it's just easy to say, yeah, it's tuna.
So some of the tuna has tuna and some of them has something else, and the quality control
Right.
of what fish is going isn't
Right.
isn't
Like
great.
if it's like,
possible.
what are those hot dogs? 50% beef. What's the other 50%? Well, it's sort of beef if you include parts you wouldn't want to eat if you saw them, right? Lips, hooves, asshole, teeth, whatever. The grinder, the pink slime. We know what we're talking about. So maybe there's something like that for fish. But I have another proposal for you. Because the person who makes the sandwiches, as you said, is a sandwich artist.
Yes.
Like famous art, this is not a pipe. This is not tuna. So it's really just a very cerebral art installation of, is the tuna sub actually tuna or not? In a way, it doesn't even matter because it's art. I look forward to people writing in supporting my theory.
I try selling that as a legal argument in court and be like, that's why we call them Subway artists. We thought about this when we put the fake tuna in.
It would work in France. you narrow-minded Anglos, Adam.
Yep.
Drug Use for Grown-Ups by Carl R. Hart is usefully filled with numerous challenges to conventional understanding of drugs and their effects. In short, almost every popular understanding is incorrect, according to Hart. A non-exhaustive list for you. Most drugs are not as addictive as people think. Most users don't become addicted. Overdoses are overcounted or could be due to confounds and confusion about dose level, not the substance itself. Much research showing how MRI brain scans of drug users having brain damage is not reliable. The notion of drugs giving some people, perceived criminals, super strength are overblown.
Super strength.
And much of science on drug use in general is biased due to greater funding for the drugs are bad perspective than the alternative.
Interesting. Yeah, that drugs are good industry is...
Winners do use drugs. Counterpoint.
Yeah.
Happily, he repeatedly stresses the important idea that anecdote is not data, and seems to live by this when discussing drugs and their impact. Unfortunately, his treatment of race in the United States seems to rely a bit too much upon anecdote instead of data. I understand that it's hard to talk about drugs without discussing the differential impact drug laws have on various racial communities, especially in the United States, but pretty much everywhere. But rigorous data should always be the approach in a work focused on facts and evidence. Hart does mention the confounds of poverty, ignorance of users, ignorance of distributors and talking heads, and how some might have had bad lives, but he didn't spend almost any time on how terrible drugs can be for some people. Perhaps he thought that that already gets the attention pretty much every time drugs are discussed, but it would have been nice to have things a bit more balanced to say that drugs do, in fact, destroy some people's lives.
Yeah, if he's shutting down myths, maybe if one of the commonly held beliefs is actually true, we can just acknowledge that, right?
Or it's only true in 5% of the case.
Okay.
And so he might say that, right? But those people still have terrible lives, right? Yeah. His point is, when things come to mind, when you picture drugs, almost every time in a movie, aside from maybe people at a club or hippies, it's a bad situation. Yes. People using drugs, they're kind of bad people for it, and or something bad happens to them, and or they have bad lives.
Yeah, no one in a movie ever does like heroin and is okay.
Right, there's not almost one scene in Breaking Bad, you're like, that's swell. That person has improved the quality of their life because they're microdosing responsibly. Yes. So he is a professor, and he does heroin regularly.
Wow.
Yes, and he's open about it. And he's like, well, look, it improves my life. Is he doing lots of it? No. Is it addictive? No, not more so than all the other things that people use.
Interesting.
Yeah. So he's speaking from personal credibility. Like his job was to, and is, administer drugs to people in controlled settings to see how they react.
Okay.
And it was marijuana. It was also heroin, all the other stuff.
Sure.
And he used to have the perspective that, yeah, that's all bad and I would never do it. I'm just studying it. And then over time, like, wait a minute, this stuff is not, it just, all the popular beliefs people have is just not quite true. So finally, I appreciated his discussion about just how judgmental so many people are about other people's drug use. Some might be willing to accept medicinal uses or those trying to reach greater spiritual enlightenment, but they look negatively upon those just trying to increase their happiness and well-being.
Sure.
Well, isn't much of what people do to increase their happiness and well-being? Why can't we just let other people be happy if they aren't hurting others? Typical liberal mindset. Such a perspective links to the general libertarian position he has and argues from in the book. I didn't really touch upon it, but that perspective is a major underlying theme of the book, and it is reasonably presented. As an American, it's like, why would the government be able to tell me what I can put in my body? That sort of thing, which is different from the argument that drugs are harmful or not, but I still think it is just a valid one because, as we know, there are laws against many of these things which say, no, you can't do it. And somebody's like, really? I'm just holding like 2 grams of something which won't harm me and I could go to jail for a long time for this? That does sometimes seem a bit ridiculous.
Well, there's really, the approach, if the approach is going to be that you're allowed to do this thing that is potentially harmful for you, I think the important part is that the person needs to have like a really informed idea of what they're doing, an informed idea of that risk and of the dangers, right?
Yeah,
which maybe we're not getting when you just say it's illegal and it's going to kill you.
Well, yeah, exactly. But also, like, compared to alcohol, right? Like there's a lot of information about alcohol. Alcohol hurts everyone much more. Now there is, of course, a usage imbalance there, right, in the stats.
Absolutely.
But yeah, I thought it was a good book. It was kind of a nice follow up for me from Michael Pollan's How to Change Your Mind, which is also about drug use from a completely different perspective. Anyway,
drugs.
check it out if it seems interesting to you.
Peace out, cuboids.
Think better to act better.
For show notes or to discuss this episode, visit our Facebook page and website at trcpodcast.com. For general inquiries or to send a topic or parody suggestion, email info@trcpodcast.com. Help support the show by leaving a review on iTunes and liking us on Facebook. Follow us on Twitter at @TRC_podcast.